My name is Tom Halverson, and everything changed the night my wife told me she was taking my stepdaughter Lily to spend Christmas with her ex-husband, slamming the kitchen door so hard the windows shook and pointing at me as she coldly said Lily needed her real father and that I could divorce her if I didn't like it. So I stayed quiet, brushed the sawdust from my hands, sat at the kitchen table, opened my old laptop, and finally accepted the Japan transfer I had refused for years, and just 1 week later she was screaming on my porch and pounding the door like she still owned the house, which she truly believed back then, though none of it began with shouting because it started on an ordinary gray Tuesday in Cedar Falls, Iowa, with icy roads, bundled up people, and another long December workday after I finished a full shift at the paper mill, stayed late fixing a noisy motor, stopped for milk and a rotisserie chicken, and walked into a home filled with the smell of cinnamon and pine, where a small artificial Christmas tree glowed in the corner with colorful lights in the window, a warm touch that belonged to Lily, who was 10 years old and loved Christmas with all her heart. Lily slid into the hallway in her socks and asked if I had fixed the dollhouse roof, and I showed her the small wooden house I had repaired after nights of sanding and gluing it back together, and when she pressed on the pink roof and saw it was strong, she smiled proudly and said she had told her mom I could fix anything, even though I quietly knew that wasn't always true, and in the kitchen Marcy stood at the stove with stiff shoulders as she stirred sauce, a clear sign of her mood. And when I mentioned our Christmas bonus would cover Lily's bike, she didn't react and instead said we needed to talk, then turned off the burner and faced me looking perfectly put together as if dressed for someone else, and told me she had spoken to Rick, her ex-husband who often missed important moments, explaining that he had invited them to his cabin for Christmas to spend time with Lily, insisting that Lily needed her real father, even though I reminded her we already had plans. I reminded her about church, the dinner at St. Luke's, and visiting her parents, but she waved it off and said those were just habits, not real plans, mocking my church events and saying Lily deserved a real Christmas in a big cabin with a real tree and her real dad, stressing that word so hard it hurt, and I told her I was the one who was always there for Lily, reading to her, taking her to appointments, and showing up at school. But she twisted her mouth and coldly said I was only the stepfather and shouldn't make it about myself because Rick was Lily's actual father and she needed that bond, adding that if I weren't so simple I'd understand, and something quietly broke inside me as I asked where I fit into all this, only for her to shrug and say nowhere this time, explaining they were leaving for a week on the 23rd and that if I couldn't accept it I could file for divorce or she would, saying it calmly like a rehearsed line, while Lily called out from the living room asking about watching a Christmas movie and Marcy ignored her, keeping her eyes fixed on me as she waited for my response. I had already spent years pleading, arguing, and explaining myself. So this time I stayed quiet and thought about the email from Tokyo offering me a final chance at a plant maintenance supervisor job in Japan, an offer I had turned down 3 times because Marcy didn't want to leave Iowa, her salon, or her parents nearby. And I remembered my father who worked decades in the same factory and always warned me not to let anyone make me feel lucky just to be included, so I calmly asked when she told Lily and learned it was the day before and that Lily was excited and Rick would pick them up. And instead of reacting I simply said I understood and would stay out of the way, which clearly surprised Marcy because she expected anger or threats, but I told her not tonight, and as she turned back to the stove calling me spineless under her breath, I walked into the living room where Lily had arranged the small wooden family by the dollhouse with the dad closest to the door, and when I asked about movie time she smiled and asked for the black and white one with the angel, and I agreed that we could watch It's a Wonderful Life. Lily snuggled under my arm with a blanket and rested her head on my shoulder as the movie played, showing George Bailey's life full of small sacrifices that most people never noticed, and while I watched, I kept thinking about all the times I had turned down the job overseas and all the quiet repairs and efforts I made believing we were building a future together, and when Lily fell asleep halfway through, I carried her to bed, tucked her in, and stood there listening to her calm breathing. Before going back downstairs where the house felt strangely empty even with Marcy nearby, and at the kitchen table I opened my laptop, reread the email from Tokyo, typed a simple message accepting the job if it was still available, paused as memories of my father's words came back to me, and finally hit send, the sound of the email leaving feeling louder than it should have, and I didn't pack or leave a note that night. I just sat there listening to the familiar sounds of the house, realizing, without fully knowing it yet, that pressing that send button was the first quiet step toward the moment when Marcy would finally face the truth she had been avoiding. When the plane landed in Canada, I felt a deep quiet I hadn't known in years, not peace exactly but the stillness that comes after a storm, and when I finally reached Tokyo it was bright and busy even at night, yet it didn't feel like it belonged to me, and I settled into a small company apartment with a tiny kitchen, a narrow bed, and a window overlooking a street full of hurried people with umbrellas. And the next morning I walked to the plant with my supervisor Kenji, a tall and gentle man, who spoke softly and smiled often, and when he introduced me to the crew everyone bowed with an easy respect that felt strange after years of tension at home, and as he told me they worked hard but looked after each other and that I would fit in, I nodded even though inside I felt invisible, like I was passing through someone else's life. And during that first week I kept checking my phone, expecting nothing from Marcy but hoping for something from Lily. And when no message came I finally sent one telling her I was in Japan and missed her, then sent another saying I had mailed her a small gift and loved her, but there was still no reply. A few nights later I bought a small wooden fox charm meant for protection, mailed it to Cedar Falls, and didn't care that it cost more than I expected, but on the walk home I passed a family laughing together as their daughter skipped between them, and watching them disappear made guilt crash down on me as I wondered if I had abandoned Lily or become no better than Rick, who left when things got hard, and though I tried to tell myself I needed time and space, the guilt followed me like a cold draft, and each night I checked my email only to find nothing, until one Saturday when I went for ramen with a younger co-worker named Ichi who noticed me constantly checking my phone and asked who I was waiting for, and when I said my daughter, or stepdaughter, he nodded and calmly said family is never simple but the truth always finds a way out, words I didn't fully understand until the following Tuesday when, sitting on my balcony eating vending machine sober, I opened Facebook and saw a neighbor's post from Iowa showing Marcy and Lily smiling in front of a large snow-covered cabin. She was wearing the red sweater I had bought her last Christmas, and beside her stood Rick, her ex-husband, wearing my old green Christmas sweater with a stitched pine tree that Lily loved, and they all looked happy in a perfect family pose outside the snowy cabin with a caption full of heart emojis, and I stared at the photo until my food went cold, feeling more than jealousy or betrayal as I realized Marcy had told me Lily needed her real father and then stepped straight into the life she wanted without me. But when I zoomed in I noticed Lily wasn't truly smiling and looked confused and uneasy, like she was forced into a moment she didn't want, and that broke something in me while fixing something else at the same time. So I closed Facebook, rubbed my face, and felt my guilt harden into resolve, though I didn't know the worst was still ahead. Because 2 days later in the break room Di walked in holding his phone and asked carefully if my last name was Halverson, and I slowly said yes. He showed me his phone, and on the screen was a public legal notice saying Marcy had filed for divorce, claiming abandonment just 3 days after I left for Japan and asking for the house and all assets, and my chest went hollow as Di gently explained she was saying I left with no intention of returning, even though she knew about the job, watched me send the email, and practically pushed me to go. And as Di quietly said that some people choose lies when the truth is inconvenient, I realized she wasn't just happy without me but was trying to erase me completely. And when I checked my email and phone again there was still nothing from Lily, only a delivery notice showing the charm I sent had arrived 2 days earlier, which told me Marcy must have stopped it, and for the first time I felt a calm, cold anger settle inside me, not loud or wild but steady and clear, and as snow fell softly outside the window and Tokyo moved on below, I understood I wasn't going back to Iowa to fix a broken marriage, but to protect a little girl who deserved the truth and to make sure her mother finally faced it. I booked my return flight that same night and landed in Iowa on a bitter, wind-burned morning where the cold stung the second I stepped outside the airport, and Waterloo Regional was nearly empty with just a few bundled-up families dragging bags through slushy snow, no one waiting for me, which was fine because I wasn't ready to face anyone yet, and I went straight to a small room I'd already booked at the VFW on Franklin Street. Nothing fancy but solid and straightforward, the kind of place that felt right when you had things to sort out. And after setting my bag down and breathing in the familiar smell of old wood and early morning coffee, a buzz-cut veteran in the hallway nodded and said he hadn't seen me in a while and asked if everything was okay, and I told him I was getting there and just needed a few days, earning one of those quiet looks men give when they know something's wrong but don't push. And later that afternoon I drove past my old house where the driveway was empty, the Christmas wreath still crooked on the door, and the little artificial tree still blinking in the window, and even though every part of me wanted to stop and knock, I kept driving because I needed answers first. So I went to Black Hawk Credit Union where Denise, a teller who'd known me for years, looked surprised and told me my wife had tried to withdraw all the money from our joint account, caused a scene when she was told she couldn't without my signature, and had to be asked to leave, claiming I'd abandoned the family and she needed the money. And when I asked why she did it, Denise just sighed and handed me a printout showing my transactions on one page and her failed attempts on the other, and I thanked her, knowing exactly how the rules worked. I told her to take care of herself and she said I looked worn out, and I admitted I was working on it before heading to HYV, not because I was hungry but because it was where half the town gathered and where stories spread fast. And as I pushed my cart through the produce aisle, I heard people talking louder than they realized, saying I'd run off to Japan with someone else and left Marcy stuck with bills and a child, and when I nearly bumped into Sandy, the cashier who'd checked me out for years, she stared and said my wife had been lying, telling everyone I'd taken off with a much younger woman after wasting my bonus, and when I told her that wasn't true she nodded and said she'd always known me as steady, adding that Marcy had been complaining non-stop and warning me to be careful now that I was back. And later that night at the VFW I sat on the bed with receipts, bank records, emails, screenshots, and the divorce papers spread out in front of me, the word abandonment glaring up like an accusation, but none of it hit as hard as the small drawing Lily had made before they left, a picture of us holding hands beside a Christmas tree, which I took from my bag, set on the bed, and stared at in silence. The thought that Lily might believe I left because I didn't want to be her dad almost took the breath out of me. So the next morning I called her school and was transferred to the counselor, Mrs. Callahan, who sounded relieved to hear my voice and told me Lily was confused and had been crying because her mother said I chose Japan over her. And hearing that made my stomach turn and my hand tighten around the phone as I thanked her quietly and sat staring at the floor long after the call ended. Knowing in that moment all my doubt disappeared because I hadn't failed my daughter, she'd been lied to, and I wasn't going to let that stand. So over the next 2 days I pulled everything together and met my old friend Eric Jensen, now a lawyer with a small office behind cases, who reviewed my binder and said the judge wouldn't look kindly on her trying to sell the house, filing abandonment just days after I left, and blocking contact with Lily. And when I asked what to do, he told me to file a response and show up to the hearing because they'd expect me to still be overseas, assuring me it would likely protect Lily if the facts held up, then slid the binder back and told me to stay calm and not confront her. Letting the court handle everything was the hardest part because staying calm took real effort, and that night I sat in the VFW parking lot watching snow fall under the streetlights as I looked across the river at the courthouse and thought about Lily sleeping somewhere nearby, probably holding the stuffed fox I'd won her at the county fair 2 summers ago, remembering how she looked in that cabin photo, not truly smiling. And in that quiet moment I made my decision that I wasn't back to fix a marriage but to fight for my daughter. So 2 mornings later I put on my best shirt and my old brown Carhartt jacket and climbed the courthouse steps with my binder tucked under my arm, pushing through the heavy doors into the Black Hawk County Courthouse, which felt cold and intimidating under the low gray sky and cutting wind, my boots echoing down the hallway toward courtroom 2B where Eric was already waiting with papers in his lap, shaking my hand and telling me Marcy wasn't there yet and likely thought I was still in Japan, which worked in our favor. And as we entered the overheated courtroom with its hissing radiators and scattered locals handling everyday disputes, I took my seat at the respondent table and waited, with neither the judge nor Marcy having arrived yet. For a brief moment I took a deep breath, my hands resting on the binder that held my evidence and my truth, heavier than it looked, and then the door opened behind me and I heard heels clicking as Marcy walked in wearing a long red wool coat with a fur-lined collar, new-looking boots, curled hair, and perfect makeup, followed closely by her lawyer, a younger man in an expensive suit wearing a smug smile. And she scanned the room confidently until she saw me and froze, just long enough for me to catch the shock, irritation, and flicker of panic. She quickly hid behind a tight smile before loudly commenting that I'd finally decided to show up, which I ignored as Eric quietly reminded me not to take the bait. And when the judge entered, a stern woman with steel gray hair and glasses low on her nose, everyone stood and then sat as she reviewed the file, called the case, and looked between us before saying she hadn't expected me to be there because the filing claimed I'd left the country indefinitely, prompting Marcy to say she believed I'd abandoned the family, just as Eric stood and firmly objected. The judge raised her hand and said the court would get to that before turning to me and explaining that since I was present, it would hear my side, cutting off Marcy's lawyer when he tried to interrupt and ordering him to sit, then inviting me to proceed. And as I stood with sweaty palms but a steady voice I explained that I left the country because my wife told me she and Lily were spending Christmas with her ex-husband, said Lily needed her real father, and told me to file for divorce if I didn't like it, which caused a murmur in the room as I went on to say I accepted a job transfer to Japan after turning it down many times for the sake of my family, that I sent messages and gifts to Lily that never reached her, and that I later learned they had been blocked or intercepted. Then I opened my binder and slid printed emails and tracking records onto the table showing timestamps and confirmations, followed by documents proving attempts to drain our joint account and sell the house without my signature. While Marcy tried to protest until the judge silenced her, and I finished by passing forward the divorce filing submitted just 3 days after I left, falsely claiming abandonment. The judge reviewed the paperwork with a clear frown as I stepped back and said calmly that I had not abandoned my family but had been pushed out and replaced, which made Marcy slam her hands on the table and accuse me of lying and running off with a woman in Japan, insisting anyone at HYV could confirm it, and when the judge asked if that was really so, Marcy doubled down before her lawyer could stop her, giving Eric the opening he needed to stand and inform the court that a witness was present, prompting Sandy, the HYV cashier, to rise from the back and step forward to say she had known us for years and that Marcy had told everyone I ran off with a younger woman and left her with the bills, a story that never rang true and was clearly false now that she saw me there, drawing a quiet gasp from the room as Marcy tried to dismiss her, only for the judge to lean back and state that Marcy had filed for abandonment just 3 days after my documented work transfer and had attempted to liquidate assets without proper authorization. The judge stated firmly that blocking communication between a child and the man she sees as a parent was extremely serious, and when Marcy couldn't respond, the judge went on to say the evidence showed a clear pattern of dishonesty and manipulation, shutting down her lawyer's attempt to recover before signing the ruling that granted me temporary primary decision-making authority, ordered Marcy to stop any effort to sell the house, launched a financial audit, appointed a guardian to evaluate Lily's best interests, and required repayment of any improperly taken funds, which made Marcy explode and shout that I wasn't Lily's real father, only for the judge to reply coldly that real fathers are the ones who stay, ending the session as the gavel struck and Marcy stormed out, and in the sudden quiet Lily appeared at the doorway with her school counselor, tears in her eyes but a genuine smile on her face as she ran to me, hugged my waist, and whispered that she knew I hadn't left her, a moment where I couldn't speak and simply held her while the courtroom emptied, knowing everything had changed because I wasn't the man who left but her dad, and in the week that followed the house felt peaceful rather than empty as I moved back in under the court's order. Lily stayed with me every other night, and even when she wasn't there I still found myself listening for her footsteps, because she had a way of filling a home just by being part of it. She hummed while brushing her hair, tapped her fingers while doing homework, and whispered to the old wooden dollhouse I'd repaired as she moved the tiny family figures around like she was fixing their lives. And the first night she stayed over she quietly climbed into my bed around 2 a.m, wrapped an arm around my chest without saying a word, and held on like she was afraid I might disappear. And when I whispered that I was still there, she nodded against my shoulder and didn't let go. And that Thursday the guardian from Lightham arrived, a woman named Donna with a clipboard who carefully checked the house, asked where Lily kept her school projects, who helped with homework, and how long she'd been calling me dad, pausing when I said since she was 3 and telling me that detail mattered more than I realized. And after she left I made grilled cheese and tomato soup, simple but Lily's favorite, dipping the sandwich corners and calling it fancy while telling me about school, her friend Clara's new puppy, and a drawing she was making of us at the Christmas festival with the popcorn machine and ice sculptures, a moment so good it made everything worth it. And just as the week was ending, on a quiet Monday morning after fresh snow covered the cracks in the driveway, Marcy came back. I had just poured a cup of coffee when a car door slammed hard enough to rattle the window, followed by another slam and rapid footsteps crunching in the snow, and then Moyu's voice. Bang, bang, bang. Open this door right now. And it was Marcy, standing on the porch with wild hair, a snowy coat, and unbuttoned boots, eyes wide and frantic, yelling if I thought I had won, and I stayed calm, telling her she had no legal right to be there, but she pushed forward, screaming about the judge humiliating her and me ruining her life. And when she balled her hands into fists I told her she hadn't stolen Lily because she wasn't something to steal. And for a brief moment her face showed fear or recognition before she shoved it away and hissed that I was nothing. And then I noticed a car idling behind her, not her usual SUV but her ex-husband's truck, and in the driver's seat was Rick, arms folded, watching silently without getting out or waving. Rick didn't even look at her and just stared straight ahead, and that's when I knew something had changed, because when Marcy turned and snapped at him to leave, he didn't respond, didn't roll down the window, didn't even acknowledge her. He simply put the truck in reverse and drove away without a word, and she spun back toward me furious, calling him a coward and lumping me in with him, but I quietly told her it was time to go, and she let out a broken scream full of anger and defeat before stomping off into the snow, slipping once on the ice and cursing under her breath as she disappeared down the sidewalk. And when I closed the door the silence felt final. And 2 hours later I opened my email to find a message from Rick titled About Everything, and after hesitating I read it, where he said he was done with Marcy, admitted he hadn't known about her lies or the abandonment filing or how she used Lily against me, apologized for his role, and said that for what it was worth, I was the only real father Lily had ever known, and I sat there for a moment and finally let out a long breath. It wasn't forgiveness or friendship, just a quiet truth from a place I didn't expect. And that evening, as the sunset filled the living room with warm orange light, Lily climbed onto the couch hiding something behind her back and told me she had made something for me, then placed a small wooden dad figure from the old dollhouse in my hand, now painted to look like me with a brown shirt like my jacket, grey flecks in the hair, and my name written in her uneven 10-year-old handwriting. And I had to swallow before telling her it was perfect as she leaned against me and asked if we could fix everything now, and I held her close and softly said yes. And later that night, after she fell asleep, I stood by the window watching the porch light glow on the snow, realizing that revenge hadn't come from anger or shouting but from letting the truth outlast the lies, staying calm while the person who tried to break me fell apart on her own, and choosing honesty, dignity, and Lily every single time. And if you've ever been pushed aside, lied to, or made to feel like you didn't matter, know you're not alone, and I hope this story reminds you that standing steady still counts.